The hybrid zone is where two different species of an animal, their ranges kind of overlap to where there could be some breeding between the two. So on our map here, you can see that we've got three different populations. Here's population 1, here's 2, here's 3. If we stay in this part of the home range of this species, or this part of the home range of this species, there's not going to be any mixing of the genetic material between these two animals. They might be similar enough that they could actually mate with each other, but they are geographically separated enough that they're not going to mix genetic material. They're going to remain separate, distinct species. However, in this little middle area right here, where all of the ranges overlap, you're going to have individuals from this population mixing with individuals from this population. They could mate with each other, producing hybrids, which is a mix of the two different species. Right here where things mix, you can see one of three possible outcomes based on strengthening of reproductive isolation, weakening of reproductive isolation, staying the way things are. So first one, reinforcement. This is strengthening of barriers. So the case we'll kind of use for this is the flycatcher, which is a type of bird you see there on the right. There are two species of it. There's the pied flycatcher, which is that one, and then there is the colored flycatcher. They've got their own distinctive home ranges, so you could say that you've got species A over here, you've got species B over here, and then their hybrid zone is somewhere in the middle here. So with these birds, we see a situation where sympatric speciation and reproductive isolation is actually reinforced. Rather than these two organisms fusing their genetic material, behaviors have become strongly reinforced such that they've become very prominent. All right, the second option is in the exact opposite direction. This is fusion, which is a weakening of reproductive isolation. So Lake Victoria in Africa, there's a species of fish that's really unique there called the cichlid. There were like 30 years ago, something like 600 different species of cichlids within this lake, and you can see some of the examples on the right. Over the last 30 years, they have found that something like 200 species of cichlids have disappeared. In some cases, that has been due to the introduction of new predators to the area, but in other cases, it looks like within hybrid zones, there's been so much mixing of genetic material that two species actually just fused into one species. One of the reasons that this seems to be the case is a lot of pollution has been introduced into the lake, and the females of certain species of cichlids make their sexual selection based on the color of the males. Because of pollution in the water, they weren't able to see as clearly, so they were more likely to mate with a male that was not of their own species. If that happens frequently enough, you get enough gene mixture, or not gene flow, but gene mixture between the two, that two species will essentially fuse into one species. So just catch this as the opposite direction. We are weakening reproductive isolation rather than strengthening it. And the last option is just stability. And I'm calling this an odd status quo. The case study for this is Bombina, which is the toads that you see on the upper right and bottom left. There's two versions of this toad. There is the fire-bellied toad on the right and the yellow-bellied toad on the left. And you can see up there, this would be like if you were moving across this thing, high allele frequency, high. Hybrid zone, boom, drops off and then disappears almost altogether in the yellow-bellied range. So that's kind of what you see as far as the allele frequencies go. Now, interesting thing is, when these two toads mate in the hybrid zone, their hybrid offspring honestly are not very healthy. They tend to have deformity of mouth parts, or they are sterile, they're not able to reproduce. So in the case of this, you would think that reproductive isolation would be strengthened because the hybrids aren't as healthy as either of the parent species. So evolutionarily speaking, the parent species should remain pretty separate, and any hybrids would die off, and that's just kind of like we're going to strengthen the wall between these two organisms. Interesting thing is, that's not what they've seen over time. Even though the hybrids produced from these two toads mating with one another are not as healthy, it continues to happen. There has not been any strengthening of reproductive barriers, or there hasn't been any weakening. They haven't fused into one species either. So we've hit this kind of equilibrium where though hybrids that are made aren't nearly as healthy, they keep being made. So we have not strengthened reproductive barriers, we have not weakened reproductive barriers, we've just kind of landed in a state of stability within this hybrid zone.